God Talk, Real God-Realisation, Most Perfect Divine Self-Awakening, and the 7 Possible Stages of Life, taken from the ALETHEON, Volume 1, page 183. The Divine Avataric Self-Revelation of His Divine Presence, Avatar Adidar Samraj. 1. There are only 7 possible stages of life, and real A Course or God or truth itself or reality itself may, in any moment, be talked about from the either real or imagined disposition of any one of them. However, actual real God realization, or the realization of truth itself, or reality itself, is profoundly more than talk and thought, or even talking and thinking about talk. Indeed, the way of real God realization, or the way of the actual realization of truth itself, or reality itself, truly begins where and when talk and thinking ceases. 2. In the literature of Adidam, which is the way that I have revealed and demonstrated for the sake of all and all, I have described the 7 potential stages of human life. Briefly, the 7 stages of human life may be summarized as follows. In the context of the first 3 stages of life, the gross body-mind complex is developed and coordinated. First, the gross physical is developed, then the emotional sexual functions are developed and coordinated with the gross physical, and finally, the mental functions and the function of the will are developed and coordinated with the emotional sexual and gross physical functions. Optimally, all of this is nurtured, guided, and done in the context of love, trust, and surrender in relation to the living A Course or divine, or the all-in-all pervading and all-in-all transcending real A Course or God, or truth itself, or reality itself. In the context of the 4th stage of life, this now complex psychophysical being is surrendered beyond itself to and into the all-in-all pervading and all-in-all transcending and self-evidently divine source or source condition that pervades and yet transcends it and the total world. This surrender is done to the point of conditional union with that divine source or source condition. In due course, such conditional union becomes, by means of divine grace, conditional union with the spiritual presence or spiritual current of that divine source, or of that divine source condition, truth itself, or reality itself, and this in occasions of tangible descending bliss that involve and simultaneously transcend the body-mind complex. In the context of the 5th stage of life, this process is continued, but the plane of conditional self-awareness ascends to become dominantly subtle or psychic rather than gross or merely physical, and the realization of conditional union with the all-in-all pervading and all-in-all transcending divine source or source condition involves the ascent of attention that eventually goes beyond physical references and at last even beyond mental references. In the context of the 6th stage of life, attention, which is the course or root or base of the mind, is introverted or, by one or another means, surrendered away from gross and subtle states and objects of the body-mind complex and toward its own root, even the ultimate root of the ego self, which is the witness consciousness when attention is active, and which is also ultimately consciousness itself, prior to objects and prior to the sense of separate self. The ultimate result of this exercise is conditional realization of the transcendental self condition, or the intuition of self-existing transcendental being, which intuition remains strategically and otherwise tacitly dissociated from all objects, even if, as in the case of the sixth-stage Sahasrara Nirvikalpa Samadhi, the natural perception and conception of phenomenal objects is freely allowed. In the only by me revealed and given seventh stage of life, there is prior and non-conditional or inherent and inherently most perfect self-identification with self-existing and self-radiant transcendental and self-evidently divine being, or the divine conscious light itself, the ultimate divine identity of all beings or subjects, and the ultimate divine self-nature, self-condition and self-state of all conditions or objects. This prior or inherent and inherently most perfect self-identification or divine self-abiding is directly realized by means of my divine avataric transcendental spiritual grace, entirely apart from any dissociative act of introversion. And while divinely self-abiding, thus, if any conditions arise, or if any states of body-mind arise, they are simply divinely self-recognized in the self-existing and self-radiant, self-nature, self-condition, and self-state of being as transparent, or merely apparent, and non-necessary, and intrinsically non-binding modifications of itself. Such is seventh stage Sahasrara Nirvikalpa Samadhi, and it is inherently free of any apparent implications, limitations, or binding power of phenomenal conditions. If no conditions arise to the notice, there is simply the self-existing and self-radiant self-nature, self-condition, and self-state of transcendental, inherently spiritual, intrinsically egoless, and self-evidently divine being. Such is absolute or inherently most perfect realization of that about which nothing sufficient can be said, and there is not anyone, anything, or anywhere beyond it to be realized. 3. Individuals at one or another stage or moment in the first 6 stages of life either pursue but do not yet most perfectly awaken to the realization of real a causal God, or of truth itself, or reality itself, or they otherwise submit to lesser purposes relative to self-fulfillment at any particular stage of life, or in the context of either the fourth or the fifth or the sixth stage of life, because of the characteristic limitations of the particular stage of life, they submit to one or another conditionally achieved, conditionally determined, and conditionally limited form of presumed real God realization that is dependent upon the necessarily conditional exercise of the body, or the body-mind, or the mind, or simply attention itself. Therefore, strictly speaking, real God realization, or the realization of truth itself, or reality itself, is a characteristic only of the only by me revealed and given final and complete or seventh stage of life. However, less strictly speaking, or as a matter of conventional reference, intended to honor the truly profound developmental demonstrations that may precede the only by my divine avataric transcendental spiritual grace given realization of the seventh stage of life. The term real God realization and the term real God realizer may also be applied to cases and degrees of developmental demonstration in the context of either the fourth or the fifth or the sixth stage of life. 4. The first 3 stages of life, not informed or inspired by the wisdom of the fourth, the fifth, the sixth, or the seventh stage of life, are in themselves characterized by the pursuit of body-based self-fulfillment, even via self-indulgence, or else via socially established conventions of morality, self-discipline, and rather materialistic hope. The fourth and the fifth stages of life, not informed or inspired by the wisdom of either the sixth or the seventh stage of life, are in themselves characterized by the pursuit of soul-based, or really mind-based, or psyche-based, and natural energy-based, or even spirit-based self-glorification, at first via popular religious faith and practice, and then via every kind of progressively esoteric and possibly spiritual and otherwise yogic searching for eternal life or immortality, whether of body and soul or otherwise simply of soul. The sixth stage of life, which is the last of the egoic or ego-based and psychophysically determined stages of life, is characterized by one or more of three possible persuasions and efforts, each to one or another degree, yet influenced or limited by the fundamental presumption of the first five stages of life. And such of these three persuasions, and each of these three persuasions and efforts, even potentially following on one another progressively, pursues or at last affirms freedom from the body-mind self, or the conditional self in the context of the cosmic round and the first five stages of life, by means of a particular mode of strategic dissociation from the body-mind self. And only by me revealing given seventh stage of life is characterized inherently and via a spontaneously self-real God-realization itself, or the absolute, almost perfect realization of truth itself, or reality itself, utterly and intrinsically and most perfectly transcending egoity, or self-bondage, separateness, and difference itself. 5. The first three stages of life are, from the disposition associated with any of the stages of life beyond them, the stages of gross ignorance, or the ordinary stages of progressive functional self-development, in themselves bereft of any influence or wisdom greater than material nature. From the disposition of any of the three orientations that are potential in the context of the sixth stage of life, the fourth and the fifth stages of life are the stages of subtle ignorance, or the stages of seeking toward the inherently impossible goal of an eternal or permanent, unopposed and only happy, conditional state and conditional circumstance of self-perfection and self-fulfillment. And from the disposition of the only by me revealed and given seventh stage of life, even the sixth stage of life is limited by the basic illusion, or by the basic apparent problem, or at least by strategic attention to the basic illusion or to the basic apparent problem of a separate self, or of a substantively, rather than merely apparently, separate self-essence, or even an essential and eternal or substantively permanent and unchanging ego-I. Thus, from the disposition of the only by me revealed and given seventh stage of life, the sixth stage of life is limited by causal ignorance, or the essence of ignorance, until, in the potential real transition to the only by me revealed and given seventh stage of life, only the non-conditional or perfectly subjective absolute or real or causal God or truth or reality itself is non-conditionally and inherently most perfectly realized as the obvious. 6. In the common world of bodily based and socially communicated conventions of aspiration and action, there is always a struggle in evidence between the tendency of humankind to remain in gross ignorance, characterized by a materialistic culture of ego satisfactions, and the necessity for humankind, one by one, to grow beyond the first three stages of life by the influence of wisdom, at least beginning with the faith principle associated with the earliest dimension of the fourth stage of life. However, from the only by me revealed and given divine disposition of truth itself or reality itself, there is always an even greater necessity inherently urged upon all, which is for humankind one by one to perfectly or always intrinsically, priorly, and in every moment immediately transcend even all the first six or ego-based stages of life, to most perfectly realize the truly ultimate and inherent freedom of absolute being, self-existing as consciousness itself and self-radiant as love bliss itself. 7. The ultimate or final stage of egoity and of the transcending of egoity is the sixth stage of life. Therefore, rightly understood, the first 5 stages of life are, in the context of the great tradition, a process of growth, of progressive psychophysical self-awareness, until the disposition of the sixth stage of life is truly and stably realized. When the point of view of gross ignorance and the pursuit of gross self-indulgence and gross or body-based self-fulfillment ceases to be the limit of individual awareness, the point of view of subtle ignorance and the pursuit of subtle self-eternalization begins and develops progressively. At any time after that new beginning, or at the earliest, once the gross bodily point of view has been thoroughly released by submission to the subtle or psyche-based and natural energy-based, or even possibly spirit-based point of view, the point of view of the root self prior to conditional nature, prior to body and mind, and therefore also prior to psyche or soul, may be realized, thus releasing even the subtle or psyche-based and natural energy-based point of view itself, and activating the potential, even possibly in spiritual terms, of the sixth stage of life. And the sixth stage of life, which is the ultimate seeking effort to achieve the transcending of egoity, is a course that is or may be progressively associated with one or more of 3 principal orientations in practice. Either asceticism or the extreme orientation toward annihilation of the psychophysical self, or the more moderately self-disciplined course and orientation toward pacification of the psychophysical self, or the ultimate course and orientation toward non-conditional or perfectly subjective self-identification and tacit or effortless transcending of the psychophysical self. 8. In the great traditional common wisdom inheritance of humankind, the characteristic or grossly ignorant orientation of the first 3 stages of life, in themselves or engaged for their own sake, is always everywhere displayed in the common world to date, and every age or epoch displays its own unique convention or style of materialistic purposiveness. In the great tradition of humankind, the characteristic orientation of the 4th and 5th stages of life is found first of all in the traditional popular religions, such as Hinduism, Christianity, Islam, and Judaism, and in all the esoteric traditions of 4th and 5th stage mysticism and mystical spirituality, or descending and ascending yoga. In the great tradition of humankind, the characteristic orientation of the 6th stage of life is found in its first or ascetical form in such traditions as Samkhya and Jainism, and in its second or moderate and self-pacifying or middle way form, principally in the traditions or schools of Buddhism, and also in the schools of Taoism, and in its third or final and non-conditionally or perfectly subjectively self-affirming form, principally in the traditions or schools of Advaitism or non-dualism, especially that of Advaita Vedanta, and secondarily or with less directness within the schools of some varieties of Buddhism, especially within the Mahayana and Vajrayana traditions, and also but with even less directness within some schools of Taoism. In the great tradition of humankind, previous to my divine avataric appearance here, the characteristic or divinely or most perfectly enlightened orientation or disposition of the seventh stage of life has not been realized and demonstrated. There has been occasional seeming or suggestive evidence in the teachings of the random few individuals and traditions, especially within the schools of Advaitism, and secondarily, or by a less direct and characteristic expression within some schools of Buddhism, but with an even less direct and characteristic expression within some schools of Taoism, of limited foreshadowings or partial intuitions or insightful but limited premonitions of the characteristic or divinely or most perfectly enlightened orientation or disposition of the seventh stage of life. However, that evidence is only verbal or limited to expressions of a philosophical persuasion only, and a philosophical persuasion that is itself founded on the sixth stage orientation, practice, and possible realization that preceded and still limits, in every case, the apparently seventh stage expression or teaching. 9. I am Adidar Samraj, the avatar of reality itself, the perfect avatar, the all-completing and final avatar, the divine avatar, the original and eternal teacher, the divine avataric world teacher, here to complete and to completely transcend the great tradition of humankind. I am the all-completing adept, the first, last, and only divine avataric adept realizer of the seventh stage of life. I am the seventh stage divine avataric realizer, divine avataric revealer, and divine avataric self-revelation of real causal God, truth itself, and reality itself. Given in this late time or would-be complete and potentially consummate era, and in this now dark epoch, as it must be described from the realized divine and transcendental spiritual disposition, and with regard to the tendencies of the times, and given for the sake of completion of the total human ordeal, and for the sake of unity, for the restoration of the cooperative prior unity of humankind. By means of my avataric full given divine word, I have revealed the characteristic and the, to one degree or another, and in one manner or another, always limited design, and the, to one degree or another, and in one manner or another, always ego-based nature of each and all of the first six stages of life, and of themselves. Therefore, in order to enable all of humankind to practice and to realize the intrinsically egoless truth and way of life, I have, by means of my avatarically full given divine word, revealed the unique and universal and inherently perfect way for all and all, which is the way of reality itself. The reality way I have revealed and now and for the hereafter always give is named by me the reality way of Adidam, or the divine avataric transcendental spiritual reality way of Adidam, or Adidam Rishiradam, and which I also declare and name to be the way of Is, or the transcendental spiritual reality way of Is, and simply the way of reality itself, or the transcendental spiritual way of reality itself, and altogether the way of conscious light, or the transcendental spiritual reality way of conscious light, and the universal traditional spirit way of the heart, and or the transcendental spiritual reality way of conscious light, and the universal transcendental spiritual way of the heart, or the radical transcendental spiritual reality way of the true divine heart, or the radical reality way of the heart itself, or simply the radical reality way of the heart and the way of perfect knowledge, or the transcendental spiritual reality way of perfect knowledge and the way of radical, or always at the root, self-understanding, or the transcendental spiritual reality way of radical, or always at the root, self-understanding, and or the transcendental spiritual reality way of the radical, or always at the root, transcending of egoity, and way of no seeking, or the transcendental spiritual reality way of no seeking, and the way of radical devotional knowledge, or the transcendental spiritual reality way of radical devotional knowledge, and the way of divine ignorance, or the transcendental spiritual reality way of divine ignorance, or the transcendental spiritual reality way of perfect disillusionment, and the transcendental spiritual reality way of radical non-dualism, and the reality of divine transcendental spiritual baptism. By whatever names and references I reveal and give and declare the unique way I have full given by means of my avatarically self-uttered divine word, it is the reality way in which the ego is always directly, intrinsically, and in every moment immediately transcended without resort to any seeking methods otherwise associated with any or all of the first 6 stages of life, and which is engaged entirely as a radical or always at the root way of life in reality itself, and even from the beginning practiced only on the basis of my 7th stage reality teachings. By means of my avatarically full given divine word, I have also revealed every characteristic, sign, design, and process associated with the realization and the demonstration of the ultimately and most perfectly egoless 7th and final stage of life. By means of my avatarically full given divine work of demonstration and blessing, I have revealed the 7th stage of life in and by and as my own divinely avatarically born bodily human divine form in life. And I have altogether fulfilled my divine avataric revelation purpose by accomplishing through the universally both given and demonstrated divine accompanying power of my all-in-all blessing divine avataric work, the firm establishment of that which is necessary, and the eternal 7th stage realization. By means of my avatarically full given divine word, I have also revealed every characteristic, sign, design, and process associated with the realization and the demonstration of the intrinsically and most perfectly egoless 7th and final stage of life. By means of my avatarically full given divine work of demonstration and blessing, I have revealed the 7th stage of life in and by and as my own divinely avatarically born bodily human divine form in life. And I have altogether fulfilled my divine avataric revelation purpose by accomplishing through the universally both given and demonstrated divine accomplishing power of my all-in-all blessing divine avataric work, the firm establishment of that which is necessary for the eventual 7th stage realization, and finally, almost ultimately divine translation of even all conditionally manifested beings. The great tradition of humankind previous to my divine avataric appearance here must generally be understood only in the necessarily limited terms of the first 6 stages of life. Whenever, even previous to my divine avataric appearance here, the 6th stage of life has been entered, the 7th stage of life has been, in principle, also the potential of human realization. However, the 7th stage adult revelation was not then given, and it is only now given by me. The divine secrets of the true devotional and transcendental spiritual reality process of the radical transcending of egoity and the divine secrets of the divine reality process of the most ultimate or seventh stage demonstration were not given previous to my divine avataric appearance here, and they are only now given by me. The always potential seventh stage realization demonstration did not appear until I appeared in order to fully reveal and to fully demonstrate the seventh stage of life, and by the very act of my fullest divine avataric appearance here and everywhere, and by means of all my unique divine avataric work of adept service here and everywhere, to make the seventh stage realization demonstration possible for all who devotionally respond to me and who practice ego surrendering, ego forgetting, and intrinsically ego transcending devotion to me, and who altogether and firmly embrace and practice the only by me revealed and given reality where Radidam. Therefore, relative to the seventh stage of life, the great tradition of humankind, the previous to my divine avataric appearance here, produced only limited foreshadowings, or partial intuitions, or insightful but limited premonitions, in the form of a few random philosophical expressions that appear in the midst of the traditional six-stage literatures. And it is these few and yet limited traditional expressions that must be studied in order to understand the character and the degree of humankind's exploration of the possibility of the seventh stage of life previous to the now and forever future time of my fully real God revealing, truth revealing, and reality revealing divine avataric work and word. There are basically only 5 possible orientations or dispositions relative to reality, each built upon or outgrowing or transcending the one immediately previous to itself. The first, or the least of these, may be called conventional monism. According to this orientation or disposition, the world, or cosmic nature, is all there is, and it is a material unity, also expressed as the individual body-mind self, which is itself a material unity. And this disposition accounts for all lesser or gross or materialistic body-based and necessarily mortal orientations or searches in the always struggling and never truly or finally fulfilled context of the first 3 stages of life in the human domain. The second or next possible orientation or disposition may be called conventional dualism. According to this disposition, the world, or even the totality of existence, is made up of a number of principal pairs, whether simply natural or somehow otherwise hierarchical. Most typically, the first of these principal pairs is a hierarchically conceived pair of God and the world, with God commonly and even popularly conceived as combining both being and consciousness and creative energy or creator energy, and creative energy or creator energy. And the other principal and most typically hierarchically conceived pairs include God and the soul, or the psyche, or the subtle personality, and also the soul and the world, and also the mind, or the psyche, or the soul, and the body. Each half of each hierarchically conceived pair, or even each natural pair, is, according to this disposition, related to and interrelated with the other half of the pair. But paradoxically, and especially in the case of hierarchically conceived pairs, each half of each pair is also utterly different than or even inherently separate from the other half of the pair. And the obligatory goal of each presumed lesser or dependent half of each hierarchically related pair is to submit to and eventually even to ascend to the greater or higher half of the pair. Therefore, from this disposition, the soul and even the total world must submit to and eventually ascend to God or God-realization. Likewise, the body must submit or be submitted to the mind or the psyche or the soul. Indeed, all that which is in the human being is of the world must, according to the hierarchical conception, submit or be submitted to and, in turn, be relinquished by the soul, which must itself, in turn, and by submitting to God and to the urge to God realization, eventually and progressively ascend to God. And this total process is indeed the total process characteristically and traditionally associated with the fourth and the fifth stages of life, and such great fourth and fifth stage popular or exoteric and otherwise esoteric traditions as have appeared in or among the forms of Hinduism, Christianity, Islam and Judaism, and in their own unique manner in or among the forms of Taoism, and also uniquely even in or among some forms of Buddhism. The third and next possible orientation or disposition may be called primary dualism. According to this disposition, the totality of existence is an apparent combination of only two primary realities. These primary realities are traditionally within the culture sphere of India called Purusha, or non-conditional, and, as such, inherently perfect and perfectly and necessarily subjective being and consciousness, and Prakriti, or objective energy, which, modified, appears as the body, the mind, all objects and all others. From this disposition, this primary duality must, first of all, be understood by observation and intuition to be actual or realities or really so. Then Purusha, or the conscious self, which, according to the characteristic and paradoxical traditional disposition of primary dualism, is ultimately a perfectly subjective or non-conditional, but also specific, independent and individual self, must separate itself, basically, by willful ascetical discipline from Prakriti, or the body, the mind, or their objects and all others. And this disposition and process, which seeks to be released from the body-mind complex or from the illusory need to eternalize the body, the mind, or the entire body-mind complex, is the first possible disposition and process traditionally associated with the sixth stage of life, and such great six-stage traditions as have appeared within Jainism and the ancient philosophical tradition of Samkhya. The fourth and next to last possible orientation or disposition may be called secondary non-dualism or secondary absolute monism. According to this disposition, there is no inherently independent and separate or separable Purusha, either as an eternal and non-conditional individual self, or, according to some proponents, as absolute being itself, or absolute consciousness itself, and the totality of existence is only Prakriti, conditionally appearing as a beginningless and endless continuum of causes and effects, or, in effect, modifications of Prakriti or of energy itself. Therefore, according to this disposition, energy itself appears and must be so observed only as ephemeral and observable or objective changes, preceded and followed by equally ephemeral and equally observable or objective changes, until, by the process of observation, insight, and self-pacification, an inherent or original or nirvanic state of energy itself is realized. However, there is an ultimate paradox necessarily associated with this orientation or disposition and process. For if the realization of the original or nirvanic state of energy itself is, in fact, achieved, how can that realization be differentiated from or otherwise be presumed to be other than or not identical to absolute consciousness itself? In any case, this disposition and process which seeks to be released from both the illusory need to eternalize the conditional self and the equally illusory need to annihilate the conditional self, and which point of view and process may, therefore, follow upon or otherwise supersede the disposition and process of primary dualism, is the second possible disposition and process traditionally associated with the sixth stage of life, and such great sixth stage schools as have appeared within the traditions of Buddhism and also within the tradition of Taoism. The fifth and final possible orientation or disposition may be called ultimate non-dualism or primary absolute monism. According to this disposition, there is, in truth, no Prakriti or separate and independent objective energy or any separate and independent body, mind, object, or other at all, but the totality of existence is only the one and absolute Purusha, or self-existing and self-radiant consciousness itself. From this disposition, the ultimate absolute, or this non-conditional and as such inherently perfect and perfectly subjective reality must, first of all, be understood and directly intuited to be actual or really so, and then perfectly or utterly affirmed by direct self-identification with consciousness itself. This disposition and process, which may follow upon or be uncovered by the disposition and process of secondary non-dualism, and which may even immediately follow upon or be uncovered by the disposition and process of primary dualism, is the third and final and principal possible disposition and process traditionally and inherently associated with the sixth stage of life, and such great sixth stage schools as have appeared in the form of the traditions of Advaitism, and also secondarily, or with less directness, within the schools of some varieties of Buddhism, especially within the Mahayana and Vajrayana traditions, and, but with even less directness, within some of the schools of Taoism. Most ultimately, this disposition and process of ultimate non-dualism or primary absolute monism is, if it is by means of my avatarity self-transmitted divine transcendental spiritual grace, most perfectly realized, the disposition and the most perfect process that by all the graceful means I have revealed and given for the sake of all who will be my devotees, establishes and characterizes the seventh stage of life. And because from the thoroughly non-dualistic disposition that necessarily characterizes the seventh stage of life, the ultimate absolute is both self-existing as absolute being itself and absolute consciousness itself, and self-radiant as absolute and perfectly subjective transcendental spiritual love bliss energy itself. It, or that one, could, as well as by many other possible and even traditional terms, be rightly indicated interchangeably by either the traditional Sanskrit term Purusha, intended in the absolute, all-inclusive or non-exclusive and non-dualistic sense, or the likewise intended traditional Sanskrit term Mahapurusha, meaning great Purusha. Da, da, da. To be continued.